Hey everybody, okay, so I thought I'd do something a little different for today's video. Now normally I'm looking at the historical and theological roots and history of the Jewish faith and the Christian faith and how they interrelate and all that, but I want to kind of zoom out and take a wider look at world religions as a whole and run us through what I think might be a kind of interesting thought experiment. And I've got a nice little slide deck for us, so let's jump in. So as we study comparative theology and look at the myriad belief systems and religions that have sprung up throughout human history and across the ages and out of different cultures, you start to almost take on an observer's position outside of these belief systems, and the question starts coming up, I wonder which one of these belief systems is true. Of course, that question is way too simple. It's too binary. First of all, because no belief system is absolutely and 100% wrong, right? They all contain some truth claims. And secondly, though, because every major belief system makes exclusive truth claims. Even the remarkably inclusive Baha'i faith is at bottom exclusionary because it's seemingly all-encompassing theology that every prophet and every sacred text from every major religion is valid. Well, that contradicts the very religions that they're trying to accept as true. In addition to that, comparative theology reveals that the world's many belief systems aren't in all cases wholly independent from one another. To use a visual analogy, belief systems, they don't correspond to one another like discrete blocks of color, but more like a rainbow. In a rainbow, red flows into orange, orange flows into yellow, yellow flows into green, and so on. So where do you draw the line between red and orange in a rainbow, right? So likewise, there are areas of overlap and blending between various belief systems too. So Hinduism flows into Buddhism, and Judaism flows into Christianity, and Taoism blends with Confucianism, and so on. And to even press this rainbow analogy a little further, in the same way that not all the colors in a rainbow touch, for example, green doesn't blend directly with red, some systems of belief also do remain disparate from each other. So prudence would require us here to approach our question that we're going to study here with a little more nuance. So what I'd like to do is propose this as the question that we're going to study. Which belief system corresponds most closely to the true state of reality? So, because we are attempting to answer what is undoubtedly an unanswerable philosophical question, our approach is going to have to take the form of a thought experiment. And our goal is going to be merely to provide a level of distinction between the primary belief systems that are held today. To answer this question is going to require both philosophical and theological analysis. So because the criteria corresponds most closely introduces a level of ambiguity, our effort could readily devolve into a question of subjective preference, right? If we're not careful. The assessment of correspondence is, or at least partly, is in the eye of the beholder. And so we're going to need to take steps to avoid our question inadvertently reducing to something like, which belief system do I prefer? So our methodology needs to be crafted in such a way that it describes as objective a study as possible. So we're going to use a four-part approach for this thought experiment. Number one, we're going to determine which belief systems will be included that we want to look at today. Number two is identifying a single truth claim which the various systems of belief can be measured against. Number three, we're going to assess the veracity of this truth claim to see if we think it's true or mostly true or where it falls. And then number four, we will evaluate each belief system's position on the truth claim that we've looked at. Okay, we'll start with step number one. Let's identify our belief systems. So because we're going to be including both religious and non-religious systems of belief in our study, we're going to use the term belief system or belief or system, something like that, rather than religion or faith. And our definition of a belief system is going to be as follows: a particular philosophy of life or conception of the world. Now, you could probably argue that there are as many belief systems as there are people in the world. However, what we want to do today is scope our study to a broad survey of the major systems of belief that are held by people today in 2021. So we're going to target the top 14 belief systems by estimated number of adherents. So in order of size, the belief systems that we're going to look at in this study are as follows. Okay, so you can see we start with Christianity, Islam, and work our way down. You'll notice that Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses were pulled out. They're going to be assessed separately from Christianity. Okay, so now moving on to step 2, let's identify a truth claim to use for our study. Now, because it's problematic to prove or disprove propositions that concern metaphysics or the supernatural realm, our goal is going to be to identify a truth claim that corresponds to a physical or historical fact or event. But even with that scope, we want to be careful to avoid facts or events that are so buried in the mists of ancient history that it's impossible to find evidence for or against them. Things like the origins of the universe or life. So we're looking for a fact event that's going to be accessible to us. In terms of our research. What we're kind of setting up here is a situation where if the fact event that we're looking at is discovered to be true, or at least highly plausible based on our supporting evidence, then those belief systems that affirm the fact event can then be appropriately judged as corresponding more closely with the true state of reality than those systems which deny the fact or the event. So we set out the following 4 criteria as our parameters in seeking a suitable truth claim for this experiment. So number 1, universality. We want a claim that's universal enough that all systems in our study either A, have an official position regarding the claim, or B, have tenets clear enough to allow us to reasonably infer a position. Number 2 is uniqueness. So a claim that's affirmed by the fewest number of belief systems is going to help us in our assessment. Number 3, we have exclusivity. The more exclusive the claim, the more effective it's going to be in helping us to pare down the list of belief systems under consideration. And lastly, objectivity. So the more demonstrable or binary or empirical the truth claim, the greater the level of certainty will be in our conclusion. But of course, it needs to be mentioned that there's no expectation at all that any belief system can be empirically proven or disproven to a certainty of 100%. Okay, so now that we have our parameters, let's search for a truth claim by looking through some of the claims made by world religions. And we'll start our search with a brief survey of the Eastern religions on our list. So Hinduism is a system that's practiced by over 1 billion people today. Yet it lays claim to no historical or physical fact events that satisfy our criteria very well. Perhaps Hinduism's most unique truth claim is karma, which is the sum of a person's actions throughout samsara, or the cycle of birth and rebirth. However, karma lacks the support of empirical evidence, and thus it's not a suitable candidate for our study. Now, the 2 primary belief systems that have evolved out of Hinduism, which are Buddhism and Jainism, they also lack a physical or historical foundation for their principal truth claims. In fact, the foundational religious tenets of all 3 of these faiths are largely detached from both the timeline of human history and from the physical world. In fact, Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, taught that, quote, depriving the body was the shortest path toward moksha. And thus his followers sought complete detachment from worldly things like clothing, food, and even shelter. Now, I need to add that this does not necessarily indicate that these are untrue belief systems. It just means that they lack the appropriate truth claims for our study. So, if we move on to Taoism and Confucianism, now both of these belief systems are believed to have begun in the 6th century BC. According to Chinese lore, both the lives of sages Confucius and Laozi, who was the founder of Taoism, overlapped, and their rival philosophies kind of developed alongside each other in China. And Taoism and Confucianism then later entered Japan in the early 5th century, followed by Buddhism, and then the combination of all these belief systems, along with Japanese folk religion, became what we know today as the Shinto faith. So, like their Hindu-based cousins, the truth claims of Taoism, Confucianism, and Shinto aren't grounded in the timeline of human history, and so they, too, lack the ideal or even appropriate physical or historical fact events for our thought experiment here. So let's turn to Islam. Now that's a belief system that has more of a historical foundation for its teachings. It's a faith based on the claim that beginning in AD 610, Allah began giving divine revelations to an Arabian man named Muhammad. So the physical location of these revelations is known. a cave on the mountain of Jabal al-Nur near Mecca, and that's part of Islam's theology, so maybe that's a good candidate. But as we look at it further and do a little bit of brief historical observation here, we see that these revelations happened in isolation. They were experienced by Muhammad alone, and because they were unwitnessed by others and spiritual in nature, the revelations lack the substantive physical or historical evidence that we would want, making them maybe marginal candidates for the truth claim that we use in the study. Again, this isn't a reflection on the truth or falseness of Islam. We're just talking about, do they have appropriate criteria for our thought experiment? On the other hand, Judaism boasts an abundant amount of historical evidence for the many figures and cultures mentioned in the Tanakh, or the Old Testament as Christians would call it. Indeed, the historicity of the Jewish faith is well documented in the archaeological record, and the creation of a people, the nation of Israel, and the giving of a specific land both factor into Judaism's theology. So maybe the ancient flood recorded in Genesis chapters 6 through 9 would make a good candidate for our study. There's a growing number of scientists that have examined geological evidence that they say supports, or some scientists even say indicate, the reality of a rapid flood event in antiquity, and I'll put some links to those resources in the description below. Where this event falls short for our purposes, however, is its lack of uniqueness and exclusivity. So Genesis chapters 6 through 9, the flood story, are part of the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh. They're also part of the Christian Bible, and that same flood event is also mentioned in the Quran in Surah 71. So this historical event, it's not a claim that would help us to distinguish between the three large Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Let's turn then to Christianity and take a look at its central defining truth claim, which is, of course, the resurrection of Jesus. Now, Christian sacred texts acknowledge that the resurrection is an exclusive issue on which the validity of the faith rests. We can read about that in 1 Corinthians 15, for example. And while the resurrection contains both theological and supernatural implications, it is at its core an event in history, right? Makes it a very strong candidate for our study. And more than that, the claim meets our criteria for both uniqueness and exclusivity, since Christianity alone affirms this fact. The resurrection also meets our criteria for universality, because the other belief systems on our list, they either A, have an official position regarding this truth claim, or they have tenets clear enough that we could reasonably infer what the position would be on the resurrection. Therefore, let's use the resurrection of Jesus as the truth claim for our study, because it best satisfies the established criteria that we've got. So let's move on to step 3, examining the claim. Christianity maintains that the resurrection is an actual historical event comprised of 6 facts. A Jewish man named Jesus was crucified and killed by the Romans outside the city of Jerusalem in the 1st century and was physically resurrected by God. Now, this claim is historical in that it involves particular persons, a specific time, a geographic location, and an unambiguous set of alleged events. So, let's look at the historical evidence for the resurrection. Now, when it comes to the resurrection, no archaeological evidence exists, okay? Professor and New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman, here's what he says. The reality is that we don't have archaeological records for virtually anyone who lived in Jesus' time and place. The lack of evidence does not mean a person at the time didn't exist. It means that he or she, like 99.99% of the rest of the world at the time, made no impact on the archaeological record. Our historical investigation of the resurrection is going to need to rely on the written record, using both primary and secondary historical sources, which, good for us, are abundant in this case. First, we're going to turn to something called the minimal facts argument. That was something put together by scholar Gary Habermas. It was developed actually as part of his PhD dissertation. And what's interesting about this is that the minimal facts argument sets out 2 requirements for any historical fact that it's going to affirm as true. First of all, it says there must be multiple strong and independent arguments that confirm each asserted fact. In other words, the vast majority of even critical scholars must recognize the historicity of the occurrence in question. And number 2, The critical scholars can be liberal or skeptical or agnostic or even atheist as long as they are specialists in a relevant field of study, such as the New Testament. So now here's what's interesting is that the minimal facts argument was able to establish 12 historical facts about the resurrection of Jesus that the majority of scholars, even critical scholars, accept as historical. Now, we don't have time and we don't need to really get into all 12, so I'm just going to give you 6 facts that were established by this argument, and I think collectively they present a really strong case for the historical authenticity of the resurrection of Jesus. You can Google Habermas minimal facts argument if you want to see the full list. Just quickly, here are those 6 facts that even critical scholars affirm. First of all, Jesus died by crucifixion. Secondly, very soon afterward, his followers had real experiences that they thought were actual appearances of the risen Jesus. Number 3, the lives of Jesus' followers were transformed as a result, even to the point of being willing to die specifically for their belief in the resurrection. Number 4, these things were taught very early, soon after the crucifixion. Number 5, James, Jesus' unbelieving brother, became a Christian due to his experience with what he believed was the resurrected Jesus. And number 6, Christian persecutor Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, became a believer after a similar experience. And again, these are 6 facts that even critical scholars would affirm as true. So let's turn now to the idea of the empty tomb. And here we've got scholar William Lane Craig talking about the empty tomb as another source of evidence supporting the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. In his book, Reasonable Faith, Craig provides us with 6 lines of evidence for the fact that the tomb of Jesus was found empty by a group of his women followers on the first day of the week following his crucifixion, which is what the claim is in the New Testament. So here, we'll just give you the highlights here. Again, you can Google this stuff, but Craig's arguments are as follows. Number 1, the tomb's location was publicly known, and the disciples' preaching of Jesus' resurrection wouldn't have been believed if there was still a body in the tomb. So, in fact, the early Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection flourished in the very city where he had been publicly crucified. Number 2, the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb is attested to by multiple early independent historical sources. Number 3, the phrase "the first day of the week" reflects ancient tradition. Number 4, the Markan story is simple and it lacks legendary development. Number 5, the fact that women whose testimony wasn't considered credible in first century Jewish society were the chief witnesses to the fact of the empty tomb can most plausibly be explained if they were actually the discoverers of an empty tomb. And number 6, the earliest Jewish polemic presupposes the empty tomb. In other words, the early rabbinic writings against Christianity didn't press back or doubt that the tomb was empty. And additional lines of evidence supporting the historicity of the resurrection are offered by J.P. Moreland, a philosopher and professor, who posits 3 additional facts that support the veracity of the event. Namely that, number 1, within weeks of Jesus' crucifixion, over 10,000 Jews were following him and willing to give up or alter all 5 of the Jewish social institutions that they had been taught since childhood. Number 2 is the fact that the very earliest Christian communities celebrated communion, which commemorates Jesus' death because they were convinced that he had been seen alive afterward, and they baptized their followers in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which celebrated a rising to new life and afforded Jesus full status as God. And number 3, the Christian church arose directly out of a first century Jewish culture. The sheer unlikelihood of something like that happening suggests that the resurrection was widely accepted as true at the time. And then theologian and pastor Timothy Keller, in his book, The Reason for God, he draws on the work of scholar N.T. Wright, and he expounds on what is essentially Moreland's third point there. He says this: in every other instance that we know of, such a massive shift in thinking at the worldview level only happens to a group of people over a period of time. But the Christian view of resurrection, absolutely unprecedented in history, sprung up full-blown immediately after the death of Jesus. Okay, so what do we have? So the scientific discipline of examining ancient history obviously doesn't deal in proofs to the same degree we see in mathematics or the physical sciences, but the combined weight of the historical evidence that we just looked at, not to mention the fact that today, 2,000 years after the alleged event, over 2 billion people still believe it's true, it leads us to reasonably conclude that the resurrection of Jesus is, at a minimum, more plausibly true than not. And that's enough certainty to continue on to our final step of the study. Let's examine the belief systems. So again, just as a reminder, the question before us is which belief system corresponds most closely to the true state of reality? Now, accepting the resurrection as true, we can now examine the responses provided to this question by the different belief systems that we're looking at. So first, I've broken them into three categories. First, let's look at the belief systems that affirm the resurrection as true. There are actually two belief systems on our list that affirm the resurrection, and those are Christianity and Mormonism. Now, the Christian sect, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Baha'i faith that I mentioned earlier, they both accept a spiritual resurrection of Jesus, but they don't accept the physical revivification claimed by Christianity. Next, we have the belief systems that openly reject the resurrection. So these systems directly reject the resurrection of Jesus by denying one or more of those 6 facts that we mentioned earlier that constitute the historical claim. So first of all, we've got Islam, who believes that Jesus didn't die by crucifixion. He was not resurrected, but he was actually bodily raised up to heaven by God. And then we have, as I mentioned before, Jehovah's Witnesses and Baha'i, who deny the physical nature of the claim, but they teach instead a spiritual resurrection. And then, of course, we have atheism, which rejects all supernatural claims, as well as the possibility that an entirely dead body could ever come back to life. And then we have Judaism. Now, Judaism teaches a resurrection of the dead in the future messianic age, but they flatly deny the specific resurrection of Jesus. And lastly, we have belief systems that appear incompatible with the resurrection. So these are belief systems that don't have an official position on the resurrection, and they don't deny the event outright, but based on their known tenets, they don't seem or appear to be compatible with the truth claim and all that it entails. So let's take a look at those. First we have, and I've kind of lumped these first ones together, we've got Buddhism, Shinto, Confucianism, and Jainism. These are belief systems that all do not recognize a creator deity or a supreme God, and so they would reject the claim that God bodily resurrected anyone. And then we have Hinduism and Sikhism. They teach the reincarnation of the soul, which is markedly different and actually incompatible with the physical resurrection that's taught in Christianity. So the concept of reincarnation is a spiritual rebirth into a new form of existence that may or may not even be human. But the concept of resurrection, by contrast, is the same human being who died is being physically brought back to life. And then lastly, number 14 in our list, Taoism. In its modern form, Taoism is highly influenced by Buddhism, and therefore it contains, as I just explained, the concept of the reincarnation of a soul, but not the physical body. So what can we conclude from this? Well, first of all, the multiplicity of belief systems held globally today and the diversity of cultures from which they arose make a fair and equitable comparison between them all different. It's not quite like apples to apples. But by choosing a specific truth claim, we've at least introduced a rudimentary level of categorization that could be, I think, helpful as we look at what is perhaps an insuperable question: what belief system corresponds most closely to the true state of reality? Now, in the end, only Christianity and Mormonism accord with reality on that historical fact. And while this thought experiment doesn't necessarily prove either belief system true, it does shed some light on the pantheon of belief systems in the world today and the comparative theology between them. And on a closing note, I found it interesting how few belief systems have a substantial grounding in empirical reality. The notable exception, of course, is atheism, which for the most part deals only in physical reality, leaving the far more important metaphysical questions unexamined. And then the atheistic religions, Buddhism, Shinto, Confucianism, Jainism, they concern themselves with morality and meaning and consciousness and other non-physical realities, but they do so devoid of any substantive doctrinal ties to physical reality. So they're kind of more abstract and floating out there. And the same can be said of most of the theistic religions on our list, including Islam and Hinduism and Sikhism and Baha'i. Interestingly, it's only the Judeo-Christian faith that really stands out from the rest because it offers this full-orbed explanation of the supernatural realm of reality, and at the same time, it boasts a wealth of touch points with human history and with empirical reality. In fact, its most critical truth claim, the one we just looked at, the resurrection, is firmly grounded in space-time. It's really the only belief system that could be proven false. While the other religions trade primarily in abstract concepts, the Judeo-Christian faith includes dirt and flesh and blood in its very theology. Thanks for watching.